Finding out your own father is choosing to skip your wedding because his new wife doesn't like you is the kind of rejection that cuts so deep you wonder if you ever really mattered to him at all. And that's exactly what happened to me when my dad called 3 weeks before my wedding to say he wouldn't be attending because it would make his wife uncomfortable. So I'm a 26-year-old woman getting married next month to my fiancé Daniel, and my relationship with my dad has been complicated ever since he divorced my mom when I was 12 and married his affair partner Valerie within 6 months. And Valerie has made it clear from day one that she resents me and my younger sister for existing and being reminders of my dad's first marriage. My dad used to make more of an effort to maintain a relationship with me and my sister when we were teenagers. He'd have us over for dinner once a week and take us on occasional outings, but Valerie always made those visits uncomfortable with her passive-aggressive comments and obvious annoyance at having us in her space. And as we got older, my dad started canceling plans more and prioritizing Valerie's comfort over spending time with us. By the time I graduated college, my relationship with my dad had deteriorated to maybe seeing him 3 or 4 times a year, usually at neutral locations like restaurants because Valerie didn't want us at their house. And our conversations were surface level and awkward with my dad constantly checking his phone to see if Valerie was texting him. When I got engaged last year, I debated whether to even invite my dad to the wedding, but Daniel convinced me to extend the invitation because he's still my father, and I might regret not giving him the chance to be there, so I sent him and Valerie a formal invitation and called to let them know personally. My dad seemed happy for me on the phone and said of course he'd be there, and I asked if Valerie would be coming too, and he said he'd have to check with her, which should have been my first red flag that this wasn't going to go well. A few weeks later, my dad called and said Valerie had decided she wouldn't be attending the wedding because she doesn't feel comfortable around my mom, who would obviously be there, and I said that was fine, and I understood. And my dad said, okay, good, and he'd see me there. I spent the next few months planning the wedding with the understanding that my dad would be attending alone, and I'd assigned him a role in the ceremony to walk me down the aisle since traditionally that's what fathers do, and I'd even ordered him a special boutonniere and reserved him a seat of honor at the reception. Then, 3 weeks ago, 3 weeks before my wedding, my dad called and started the conversation by saying he needed to talk to me about something difficult, and I immediately knew it was going to be bad news. He told me that he'd been thinking a lot about the wedding and talking with Valerie, and they'd decided together that it would be better for their marriage if he didn't attend because Valerie was feeling insecure and upset about him going to an event where my mom would be, and she didn't think it was fair that he'd choose to spend a whole day celebrating with his ex-wife while she stayed home alone. I was absolutely speechless, and I asked my dad if he was seriously telling me he was skipping my wedding because his wife was jealous, and he said it wasn't about jealousy. It was about respecting Valerie's feelings and maintaining peace in his marriage, and he hoped I'd understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices. I told him the difficult choice he was making was choosing his wife's insecurity over his own daughter's wedding, and he got defensive saying Valerie is his wife and partner, and her feelings matter just as much as mine, and I said, actually, Dad, on my wedding day, my feelings should matter more than your wife's jealousy issues. He said I was being unfair and making this harder than it needed to be, and if I really cared about his happiness, I'd understand why he couldn't attend. And I told him if he really cared about me, he'd tell Valerie to deal with her insecurity like an adult, and he'd be at his daughter's wedding. The conversation ended with my dad saying he was sorry, but his decision was final, and he hoped someday I'd forgive him. And I hung up on him and immediately started crying because my own father was choosing not to walk me down the aisle because his wife couldn't handle being apart from him for one day. I called my mom and told her what happened, and she was furious but not surprised. She said Valerie has always been controlling and insecure, and she's systematically isolated my dad from everyone in his life who predates their relationship, and my dad has allowed it because he's too weak to stand up to her. My sister was equally unsupportive of my dad's decision and said she wasn't surprised either, and she told me that Valerie had convinced my dad to skip her college graduation 2 years ago for similar reasons, and my sister had been so hurt she'd barely spoken to him since. I reached out to my dad's brother, my uncle, to see if he could talk some sense into my dad, and my uncle said he'd try, but he warned me that my dad has become completely controlled by Valerie, and he doesn't make any decisions without her approval anymore, and it's been sad to watch him lose himself in that relationship. My uncle did call my dad, and apparently they had a big argument where my uncle told my dad he was making a huge mistake and would regret missing his daughter's wedding. And my dad said everyone was being too hard on Valerie and not understanding her perspective, and Valerie got on the phone and started yelling at my uncle for interfering in their marriage. After that conversation, my uncle called me back and said he tried, but my dad is beyond reasoning with, and I should accept that he's not coming to the wedding and plan accordingly. I had to scramble to figure out who would walk me down the aisle, and I ended up asking my uncle to do it since he's been more of a father figure to me in recent years anyway. And my uncle was honored and said he'd be proud to walk me down the aisle. I also had to deal with all the practical details of my dad not attending, removing his name from the program, reassigning his seat, canceling the special father-daughter dance I'd planned, and every change was a reminder that my dad chose his wife over me. The hardest part was telling people why my dad wouldn't be at the wedding, because everyone assumed he'd be there and kept asking about his role in the ceremony. And I had to explain that he decided not to attend because his wife doesn't like me and didn't want him celebrating with my mom. Most people were shocked and sympathetic, but a few family members on my dad's side suggested maybe I should try to understand Valerie's position better and consider postponing the wedding until everyone could attend, and I shut that down immediately, saying I wasn't postponing my wedding because my dad's wife is insecure. My dad sent me a card 2 weeks before the wedding with a check for $500 and a note saying he was sorry he couldn't be there, but he hoped the money would help with wedding expenses. And I ripped up the check and sent it back to him with a note saying, I don't want his guilt money. I wanted my father at my wedding. Valerie apparently saw my note and called me screaming about how ungrateful and disrespectful I was, and how my dad was trying to do something nice, and I threw it back in his face. And I told her she'd successfully driven a wedge between my dad and his children, and she should be proud of herself for destroying our family. The wedding is next week, and I've made peace with my dad not being there, or at least I'm trying to, and my uncle has been wonderful about stepping into the father role and making sure I feel supported and loved. My mom has been incredible too. She's helped me reframe this as my dad's loss rather than my failure, and she's reminded me that I deserve people in my life who show up for me unconditionally, and my dad has proven he's not one of those people. I've decided that after the wedding, I'm going no contact with my dad, because this was the final straw in a long pattern of him prioritizing Valerie over his children, and I'm done begging for scraps of attention from a father who's made it clear we're not his priority. My sister fully supports this decision and said she's been essentially no contact for a while anyway, and her life has been better for it. And we've talked about how sad it is that we've both lost our father not to death, but to his choice to abandon us for his wife. Some extended family members think I'm being too harsh and that I should keep the door open for reconciliation. But I've explained that I'm not closing the door. My dad is, and he's welcome to walk through it any time he decides to prioritize his children over Valerie's insecurity. But I'm not holding my breath. So that's the story of how my dad chose to skip my wedding because his wife doesn't like me, and how I've decided to move forward without him in my life. And while it hurts, it's also liberating to stop hoping he'll change and accept that this is who he is. If your parent has ever chosen a new partner over you, how did you handle it? And were you able to forgive them, or did you walk away? Share your experience in the comments because I'd love to hear I'm not alone in this. And if you think I'm making the right choice, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about choosing yourself. Thanks for watching.